There is a photograph taken somewhere in Tokyo in 1962. A narrow street. Wooden shop fronts on both sides, their sliding doors open to the morning air. A woman in an apron standing in a doorway. A bicycle leaning against a wall. Children walking past in school uniforms. Above the shops, washing lines strung between buildings with laundry moving in the wind. Nobody thought to label what was in the photograph. Nobody wrote down the name of the street. Why would they? It was just a street. It was just Tuesday. That street does not exist anymore. The shops are gone. The wooden fronts are gone. The woman in the apron and whoever she was waiting for are gone. What stands there now is something efficient and clean and entirely without memory. This is the story of the streets that Japan lost. Not the famous ones. Not the temples and the castles that tourists photograph. The ordinary ones. The ones that nobody thought to save because nobody imagined they would need saving. The Shotengai was the spine of every Japanese neighborhood. A covered shopping street, usually running 200 or 300 meters, roofed against the rain with a long arcade of translucent panels that turned the light inside a particular color. Gray on overcast days, pale gold when the sun came through. Shops ran down both sides. No two were identical. A fishmonger beside a shoe repairer, beside a shop selling stationery and school supplies, beside a woman who made and sold pickles from barrels that sat in her doorway, filling the immediate air with salt and fermentation. The Shotengai was not designed for efficiency. You did not go there to complete a list quickly. You went because it was where your neighborhood existed in physical form. The fishmonger knew your face and knew that your husband didn't eat mackerel and your children would eat anything if it was fried. The woman who sold pickles had been selling them since before you were born, and her daughter would sell them after her. The shoe repairer had fixed every pair of shoes in every household on your street for 30 years, and he kept a small record in his head of which soles wore down fastest and on which side, because that told him something about the person walking in them. At its peak, Japan had over 17,000 shotengai. Cities had dozens of them, each one serving a specific neighborhood, each one slightly different in character from the one 2 streets over. They were not retail infrastructure. They were the physical shape of community life. The supermarkets arrived in the 1960s, then the shopping centers on the edges of cities in the 1970s and 80s, then the convenience stores on every corner. Each arrival took something from the shotengai. Not all at once, a few customers at a time. A shop that closed when the owner retired and whose children had moved to the city and had no interest in inheriting a pickle business. A fishmonger who could no longer compete with the refrigerated display cases 20 minutes away by car. By 2020, more than half of Japan's shotengai were officially classified as shutter streets. Shotengai, where more than a third of the shops had closed permanently and the shutters had come down and stayed down. You can still walk through them. The roofing is still there. The bones of the shops are still there. But the shutters are rusted now, and the signs above the closed fronts have faded to the point where you can barely read what used to be sold there. The Tonya was a different kind of street entirely. In the old merchant districts of Edo period Japan, and in the cities that grew from them, there were streets given over entirely to a single trade. A street of fabric merchants, a street of paper sellers, a street of metal workers, a street where every building dealt exclusively in lacquerware or candles or the tools used to make tatami mats. These streets developed over centuries because specialization created knowledge. A merchant who had sold fabric for 40 years on a street where every other merchant had also sold fabric for 40 years knew things about fabric that no generalist could ever acquire. He knew which dyes held their color and which faded by the third washing. He knew which weaves suited which climate and which garments. His customers trusted him not because he was convenient, but because he was the repository of knowledge accumulated across generations. The wholesale districts of Osaka and Tokyo preserved some of these single-trade streets into the 20th century. Ningyocho in Tokyo, Semba in Osaka. Specific blocks given over entirely to kitchen knives or ceramics, or the bolts of fabric used in kimono making. You walked down them and felt the concentrated weight of expertise on every side. Most of them are gone now, or so altered that the specialization has become decorative rather than functional. A few surviving shops selling to tourists and collectors, the rest converted to restaurants and cafes that reference the old trade in their names and their interior decoration without actually continuing it. There was a kind of shop in every Japanese neighborhood that has no direct equivalent in the English language: the dagashiya. A tiny shop, sometimes no bigger than a single room, sometimes operating out of the front of someone's house, selling cheap sweets and small toys and little paper games to children. The prices were designed for the coins that children carried: 1 yen, 3 yen, 5 yen. You could spend 20 minutes standing at the counter with 10 yen in your palm, deciding what to do with it. The woman who ran the dagashiya was almost always elderly. She had been running it for decades. She knew every child in the neighborhood by name and by temperament. She knew who would spend everything immediately and who would stand deliberating for so long that other customers formed a queue behind them. She had opinions about which children were being raised well and which ones needed watching, and she was not shy about expressing them. The dagashiya sold things that existed nowhere else: tiny packets of powder that fizzed on your tongue, thin sheets of sugar printed with cartoon characters that you peeled off and ate, small wax bottles filled with colored syrup, strips of dried squid sold alongside the sweets without anyone finding this combination remarkable, ramune candy, hard and dissolving, that left a particular chalky residue on the back of your teeth for the rest of the afternoon. But the dagashiya was not really about the sweets. It was about the transaction. Standing at that counter with a small amount of money and an enormous amount of choice and the pressure of other children waiting. That was the education. Making decisions with limited resources while other people watched is a skill that turns out to be useful throughout a human life. The dagashiya began disappearing in the 1970s as convenience stores spread through Japanese neighborhoods. The convenience store sold everything cheaper and in larger quantities. It was open all night. It was clean and lit with the particular aggressive brightness of fluorescent tubes. Against all of that, a tiny room run by an elderly woman selling single sweets for 1 yen could not compete economically. Most of the women who ran them simply grew too old to continue, and nobody took over. The stock was sold or given away. The rooms became storage or were absorbed back into the house. The neighborhood lost something precise and irreplaceable, and nobody held a ceremony for it. If the dagashiya was where children spent their coins, the sento was where adults ended their day. A public bathhouse. In the period before private bathrooms were standard in Japanese homes, which for most ordinary families meant anything built before the late 1960s, the sento was not a luxury. It was a necessity. You went every evening. You brought your own soap in a small plastic or wooden box, your own towel, your own shampoo. You changed in a communal dressing room watched over by a bath attendant who sat elevated above both the men's and women's sides and could see both changing areas at once. A position of impartial civic authority that was peculiar to the sento and existed nowhere else. You washed yourself completely at a low tap before entering the communal bath. This was not optional and not negotiable. The communal bath was for soaking, not for washing. You entered it clean. The water was maintained at a temperature that struck newcomers as dangerous and regulars as merely correct. What the sento provided beyond cleanliness was proximity. You were physically close to your neighbors in a context that stripped away most of the signals of social status. An office worker soaking beside a construction worker, beside an elderly retired school teacher. Nobody had a better position in the bath. Nobody had a worse one. The heat was the same for everyone. The conversations that happened in Sento were different from conversations that happened anywhere else. Something about the heat and the water and the removal of the ordinary armor of clothing made people speak differently. Problems were mentioned that would not have been mentioned on the street. Advice was given and received across social distances that would have been impassable in ordinary settings. At its peak, Tokyo had over 2,600 public bathhouses. As apartments came equipped with private bathrooms through the 1970s and 80s, the Sento lost its essential function, one household at a time. The ones that remained became something subtly different. Not necessity, but ritual. Kept alive by older residents for whom 40 years of habit had made the walk to the bathhouse as natural as breathing. And by younger people who had discovered in the Sento something that their private bathrooms could not provide. The company of strangers in shared warm water. By 2023, fewer than 500 remained in Tokyo. The closures continue at a rate of roughly 1 or 2 per month. Each one that closes takes with it the particular community that had formed around it. The regulars who had been coming for decades, the conversations that happened there and nowhere else, the specific smell of the changing room, and the specific temperature of the water that the owner had maintained at exactly the same degree for 30 years. On certain streets in Kyoto and in the older districts of Tokyo and Osaka, you can still find them. A narrow frontage, a fabric curtain hanging in the doorway, split in the middle so you push through it. Inside, low tables and cushions on the floor. A woman behind the counter who has been cooking the same dishes since before you were born. The Capo restaurant, the small family-run eating house that occupied the ground floor of a wooden building that had stood on the same spot for 100 years. These were not restaurants in the sense that modern restaurants are restaurants. There was no printed menu. There was what was fresh today, what had been made this morning, what the woman behind the counter had decided to prepare based on what the market had offered her at 6 a.m. You sat down and she brought you things and you ate them. If you had a preference, you could mention it. If she thought your preference was wrong for today, she would tell you so. The relationship between a capo and its regular customers was decades long. A family might eat at the same small restaurant once a week for 30 years, watching the children of the woman who ran it grow up and begin helping behind the counter and eventually take over when their mother's knees gave out. The food was not remarkable in the way that celebrated restaurant food is remarkable. It was remarkable in the way that something made with complete attention and genuine care every single day for 30 years becomes remarkable. Not through innovation, but through the accumulation of practice into something so refined it becomes invisible. Urban redevelopment took most of them. The wooden buildings they occupied were fire risks and structurally outdated and sat on land that was worth more as something else. When the woman who had run the kitchen for 40 years reached 80 and could no longer stand for 4 hours at a time, and her children had become accountants and teachers and had no interest in the restaurant life, the capo closed. The building came down. A concrete structure went up. There was a sound that moved through Japanese streets on certain mornings that does not exist anywhere in the world now. A long, low horn note. Distant at first, then closer. The tofu seller was coming. He carried fresh tofu made before dawn in wooden buckets, on a cart or balanced on a pole across his shoulders. And the horn was the signal that brought women to their doorways with bowls in their hands. He cut the tofu to order with a wire and placed it in the water you held out to him. You paid. He moved on. The whole transaction took 40 seconds. The tofu was made that morning. It had a softness and a particular clean flavor that packaged tofu kept refrigerated for days cannot replicate. Regular customers said they could tell the difference between tofu made that morning and tofu made the previous afternoon. The tofu seller said the same thing, and he was in a position to know. He was not just selling food. He was maintaining a connection between the household and the person who made what the household ate. You knew his name. He knew yours. You knew that the quality of what he sold was directly attached to his own reputation, which he walked through your neighborhood every single morning, and which he would be walking through it again tomorrow. As supermarkets spread through Japan in the 1960s and 70s, packaged tofu became cheaper and more convenient. The tofu seller's route shortened street by street as households switched. By the 1980s, he had largely disappeared from cities. A few continued in rural areas into the 1990s. Some older residents say they still hear it sometimes in half-sleep. The long, low horn note at a distance coming closer. And then they wake up fully, and the street outside is quiet, and they remember that they have not heard that sound in 40 years and will not hear it again. The covered shopping street with its shuttered shops. The dagashia, where a child could spend 20 minutes deciding what to do with 3 yen. The public bathhouse, where the water was the same temperature for everyone. The small restaurant in the wooden building where the menu was whatever was fresh this morning. The tofu seller's horn moving through the street before breakfast. These things were not remarkable when they existed. They were simply the texture of daily life, the background against which everything else happened. So constant and so ordinary that nobody thought to describe them while they were still present. That is always the way with the things that matter most. You notice them only after they are gone. You realize what they were only once the streets are quiet and the shutters are down and the particular sound and smell and warmth of a specific place on a specific morning in a specific decade is available nowhere in the world except in the memory of the people who were there. If any part of this took you somewhere you had forgotten, leave a comment below. And if you know someone who remembers these streets, send this to them.